Hello, fifth grade, and Happy New Year. First off, I want to say congratulations on a wonderful Explore project. I know some of your teachers have shared with me some of your presentations and your flip grids that you did, and I was able to kind of peruse them. And I'm super proud of all the hard work you guys put into learning about your European Explorer. So we're starting this new year and we're now going to start focusing on the main part of our fifth grade social studies content, which is the forming of the United States and how did we become the United States. So in doing so, we are going to talk about the British Empire. You focused on a European explorer that helped find the New World, right? Considering North America, South America, we all know they were trying to find a way to Asia. And they eventually realized they weren't going to be able to find an Asia across the Atlantic going westward. But in doing so, they claimed most of North America and South America. So during this time of European exploration, what you found out from your explorer was that if you were a French explorer, this area, kind of like what would be the Great Plains through the Midwest into parts of the South, um, and into parts of Canada, was claimed by France. The Spaniards took over, right? They were the largest empire during this time. They were pushing this exploration so much into the New World. So, right here, you have so much of South America into Mexico, where we are, Canada, this is the Southwest into Texas. They have Florida. They have the Caribbean islands. And that is all claimed by Spain. And then Portugal, who were actually the founders of navigation, had this stronghold in Brazil. I think that's parts of Argentina there, and in other parts of South America. Now, what's not here is that Portugal also has a lot of strongholds along Africa, and we're going to talk about that later on in our next chapters when we talk about slavery, because the Portuguese actually start the slave trade from West Africa, and they build a lot of their ports because remember, they were going south along the Atlantic and going up around Africa to get to India. So while doing so, they claimed a lot of those ports and lands around there. But right here, it's just this is where we're at. This is where the world is. After we are talking about your European explorers, through the 1600s. Now we're going to start talking about the British colonies and, the founding of the United States of America. And in doing so, we want to see, where is the British Empire right now? The British Empire around the 1750s they have this northern Canada section, right? Henry Hudson. They found Hudson Bay. Here's the Hudson River. France claims parts of this land in here as well. But then this section right in here, this is what we're going to be focusing on. This is going to be the site of the 13 colonies. And this is going to be the main part of our history, social studies content that we're going to focus on, is this section right in here. But before we start that lesson, we'll do that later on this week, and into the next week, we'll talk about the first 3 colonies of the British Empire. But what I really want us to focus on is just knowing about the British Empire. We've talked about Spain. If you briefly remember, I know so long ago, it was almost before Thanksgiving when we were talking about Spain and how Spain had this stronghold in the world. Spain was this huge empire. They were pushing exploration. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, and they were focused on, claiming land, gaining gold, and in doing so, they had this huge armada. Well, at the end of their exploring and exploration, there was a huge war between Britain and Spain, and Britain, with their naval power, was able to defeat the Spanish Armada, which at the time was the largest in the world. And that's why Spain was this huge conglomerate and had places all over the world. By doing that, by disseminating the Spanish Armada, Britain gets their foot in the door and they're able to start gaining their wealth and prestige. So we're going to talk about the British Empire. So in your binder, you have a packet that looks like this, and it says the British Empire. This is actually from ReadWorks, if you remember using ReadWorks from previous grades. So I'm actually going to play the audio for the reading. We're going to follow along, and then we're going to do the questions together. But while we're doing the questions, let's kind of remember what we should be focusing on, right? So we want to know, what does it mean when it says the sun never sets on the British Empire? We want to know, what are the places that were part of the British Empire? And the influence that the British colonies, the British Empire Parliament had on the colonies, and the effects always on the natives. When we learned about European exploration, depending who your explorer was, and if you listen to other students' speeches, you may have picked up that many of the conquistadors of Spain disseminated the majority of the indigenous populations through South America, Mexico, parts of North America becomes a little bit different. France had a different take with the natives and actually had a more amicable introduction with them and created these relationships and started these like fur trades and posts. British influence with the natives is a little bit iffy. We read some of it during Blood on the River. But for the most part, when we look at South America into Mexico, all of here just gets pretty much eliminated by the indigenous populations. It's very hard to find indigenous populations still that are rooted there. Some in the Amazon and in the deep forest, there's still some populations that still exist, but for the most part, they were practically extinct by the end of this exploration period because of the effects of Europeans coming and bringing diseases or having full-blown wars with the natives in those areas. So we're going to read the Read Works passage, and then we're going to go through the questions.
The British Empire, An Introduction to the British Empire. By Read Works. Great Britain is an island in Western Europe. It includes England, Scotland, and Wales. But from the 1500s onward, Great Britain was a huge empire. It was so big, people said, the sun never sets on the British Empire. When it was nighttime in Great Britain, the daytime sun was shining on its colonies in Asia. By the end of the 1800s, Great Britain's empire was the largest in history. It ruled colonies on every continent including Canada, India, the West Indies, Australia, and New Zealand. It also ruled much of Southeast Asia and a large part of Africa. Great Britain created its empire through imperialism. Imperialism is when a country takes over another place's territory or economy. To establish a colony, Britain would take over a new area of land. Inhabitants were told they were under British rule. Then, Britain would set up a colonial government ruled by the English crown. The native people had very little voice in the government. Great Britain wasn't the only imperialist country. The late 1800s are often called the Age of Imperialism. During this time, several European countries including France, Germany, Portugal, and Spain divided up Africa and Asia. Why did these European countries want so much new territory? One reason was simply prestige and wealth. But Britain's desire went beyond wealth like gold. It was also driven by the Industrial Revolution. England, Scotland, and Wales are not very big. Their factories didn't have all of the natural resources they needed. They relied on colonies for raw materials, like lumber from trees, to produce industrial goods. Great Britain also relied on its colonies to buy the goods it produced. After natural resources were shipped to British people, they were used to make finished products. Great Britain would then ship some of these finished products, such as clothing, back to its colonies. The colonies would be forced to buy British clothing instead of making their own. By doing this, Britain always had a market for its goods. Eventually, Great Britain no longer ruled its colonies. In the 1900s, they gave up most of its empire. It helped many of its colonies become politically independent countries. Many of these new governments became democratic parliaments, like Britain's. Their laws were modeled after Britain's as well. Britain's influence lives on in many of its former colonies to this day.
All right, so now we're going to go through the questions and reuse the passage as our guide to answer them. So the first part of this passage tells you about what? Well, it says Great Britain is an island in Western Europe. It includes England, Scotland, Wales, but from the 1500s onwards, Great Britain was a huge empire. It was so big, people said the sun never set on the British Empire. When it was nighttime in Great Britain, the daytime was shining on its colonies in Asia. So, the United Kingdom today, no, it's not about today. Great Britain and how it lies in Western Europe. Well, that's the one sentence about it, but this would have to give more geography information. How Great Britain Empire was the largest in history. So, but from the 1500s onwards, I would say that because that's the majority of those sentences. And the women of British colonies. So that's a no. So I'm going to go with C. What does it mean? The sun never sets on the British Empire. So the sun always shines on Britain. Well, we know that's not what it meant. The sun was always shining on some part of the British Empire because it was so large. The British Empire's raw materials like trees back to Britain to make industrial products. Well, that's later on in the passage. That's not happening in this first paragraph. The British Empire needed a lot of sun. Probably not. So I think B is the best part, right? Because it's so large that there was always daytime during some part of the world where it existed. All right, prestige. What does prestige mean? If you do not know what the word prestige means, I suggest you look it up. So prestige means widespread respect, admiration felt for someone or something of achievement and quality. So arouse respect and admiration. So fear, no. Influence, goodness, and money. I'd definitely say influence is the same as like admiration, respect, right? They had a huge influence on the world. All of the following were part of the British Empire in the 1800s except for. So let's see, by the end of the 1800s, so that's the part that gives me the topic sentence, tells me that this is the part where I'm going to find that answer. It was the largest in history. It ruled colonies on every continent, including Canada, India, West Indies, Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and a large part of Africa. So Australia, Canada, India, Mexico is not mentioned. So Mexico is my not mentioned in that part. Which of the following is least likely to be part of the influence British leftover of the British imperialism? So that was at the end of the reading. So remember the very end of the reading. It says they no longer ruled its colonies. In the 1900s, they gave up most of its empire. So when it gave it most of its empire, it said many of the new governments began democratic parliaments like Britain. Their laws were modeled after the Britain as well, and the influence lives in many of its former colonies. So we have English language. Well, if they're following the rules and the government and the laws, then you know they're following English language. And English is one of the primary languages in the world, so we know that's a yes. And they're asking for the least likely. Parliament government, they mention English music and an education system based on the British model. So definitely government and language. Now let's think about this. Music and a British model. Education system. Well, education system would be the schooling, how kids are separated by grades, teaching children English. So if they're speaking English, that means they're teaching English. And English music, well, English music is all over the world. But if we think of cultural countries like Africa, India, Asia, they all have their own music, right? Because that's a cultural aspect. And they're not talking about the culture, they're talking about the influences of writing and rules and thinking. So I would say education definitely fits in with an influence, but music definitely would not, because the end of the 1900s, I think the share of music, they didn't have internet. Nowadays, that's a little different. English music is all over the world, but definitely every country has its own cultural music. Let's go to the next page. All right, what challenges might have been ruling an empire so large? Now, this is a what if question. So we have to think about this together. What are some challenges that might be of ruling an empire so large as Britain? Now, it said that it took the natural resources from its colonies and brought them back to Great Britain. I could see a challenge in that. It was so large that it was always daytime somewhere. So if it was ruled by the crown and it was ruled by the Britain government, it'd be very difficult for them to follow through on maybe issues or conflicts that arose in these places because they're on the other side of the world. It would be hard for, it also mentioned, that the natives had to take over and were under the rule of Britain. So I can find that as a challenge. So what challenges? So let's think about this and put them all together. Feel free to write your own challenges. And we have the keyword might, right? So there's no right or wrong answer. Challenges. So, challenges that Britain might have faced for ruling an empire so large are dealing with opposition from natives, handling conflicts in the colony, and transporting resources to and from the colonies. Feel free to think of anything else. These are might. So, definitely interested to see what you think are challenges that Britain would have faced. After reading the passage, what can you infer as to why some of the native people of these colonies might have been frustrated with being a part of an empire? So, in the reading, it said, to establish a colony, Britain would take over a new land. Inhabitants were told they were under British rule. So think of, for example, the natives in the indigenous populations of America and our Native Americans, and them being saying, all right, your chief is no longer the chief. You don't follow those rules. You're following the King of England. They would set up a colonial government ruled by the English crown, and the native people had very little voice in the government. So they're taking over the land, and they're saying, oh, this farmland, this hunting ground is no longer yours. We're going to build our fort and our palisades in this area. So what would cause frustration for the natives, right? So native people would have been frustrated with being a part of the empire because, and we'll come up with some of our reasons. All right, so you definitely can come up with your own. This is an inference, and we all have different inferences. But more or less, native people would become frustrated with being a part of an empire because they had no voice to share their complaints. Their land was taken by force. Natural resources were overly harvested. Their rule of laws was ignored, or you could say their customs and rule of law was ignored. The person who was their chief no longer had a say of what was a correct way of going about things. And we've already talked about the Native American groups. You have to think back about the Native American group that you focused on when we were back in chapter 3. We talked about the regions of the United States. One key part is that the indigenous populations of the Americas were able to live on this land for hundreds and hundreds of years before Europeans came onto it because they respected the aspects of the land, right? They didn't just take and overhunt every bison around, right? They only took what they need. They used every piece of an animal besides its meat for their tools and their clothing. They didn't cut down every single tree for a home. They did it as was needed. So there was a respect for the land, whereas when Europeans come, they eradicate huge forests, huge populations of animals simply to bring resources back to Europe and for them to set up their own colony. It's an incomplete sentence. Choose a word. Okay, so next. Great Britain expanded the markets for its goods, blank, creating new colonies where it would ship British products. So this was... Okay, so Great Britain would ship some of the finished products, such as clothing, back to the colonies. The colonies would be forced to buy British clothing instead of making their own. By doing this, Britain always had a market for its goods. Expanded the markets for its goods without creating new colonies? No, because creating new colonies, by making new colonies. So they made new colonies, which allowed them to have new places to sell their goods. This piece right here, we're going to get into this later on. Colonies were forced to buy British clothing instead of making their own. This is a key part. I I mean, there are many things that lead to the American Revolution, but this key piece here where the colonists were forced to buy British goods, were forced to buy the British things, creates a huge problem later on in history when the Britain starts taxing the colonies for all these items that they need to have. So just keep this in mind, that this is a huge problem that will eventually lead to more distress and unrest amongst the colonies. All right, and let's go to the next page. All right, Parliament is a specific representative group with legislative powers. So we have Congress, which is the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Use vocabulary word in the sentence. So Parliament, what can you think of Parliament? Well, there are many sentences, I think, in here that use the word Parliament, if I'm not mistaken. We can say that Britain's Commonwealths have a parliament similar to Great Britain. A commonwealth is after Great Britain no longer ruled its colonies, a lot of those places are still called commonwealths. For example, like Australia, they still have part of the British, I think it's called the Union Jack, if I'm not mistaken, their flag on their flag. So some countries still have part of those British connections and are called commonwealths. So come up with your own sentence. I'm going to use one from the text because I find that a little bit easier. So I said many British Commonwealths established democratic parliaments modeled after Britain's. All right, so we just finished reading about the British Empire. And one thing we just want to keep in mind is that at the end of European exploration, the British Empire takes over in a large part of colonizing the world. And our next lesson is we're going to talk about the first British colony that attempts to be established in the New World, or what will become the Americas, North America. So be sure that you post pictures of your completed packet into your Padlet or on your Google Classroom, whichever way your teacher wants work submitted. Have a great day, 5th grade.